Hey friends, for those of you who've been following my channel for a while, you know that I've been making this practice sculpts on my weekends and usually of these little animals, sometimes anatomy, and I've been posting this on various social media, and one question that some people ask recurrently is how I render this. So this is not done in Zbrush. I do my rendering in Maya with Redshift, and the reason for that being that that's something I use for my work, and I feel comfortable using that. And while Zbrush BPR renders can produce some awesome results, personally it's not something I've used in a very long time, so I basically don't really know how to make really great looking renders like some people do them in Zbrush, because simply it just doesn't fit into my work pipeline. But I will show you how I set up this type of studio lighting and render in Maya and Redshift, and hopefully it should be quite easily transferable to other packages such as Blender, Cycles, and Arnold and Maya or 3ds Max, because none of this stuff is render specific. You can probably copy it around very easily. So yeah, I start off with a sculpt like this. I then keep it in Dynamesh, like that's how I create the sculpt. And for this kind of little previews, you know, this is something I sculpt in maybe an hour on the weekend or something like this. So I don't bother retopologizing, UVing, and so on. I just take this and export it using the FBX export import with a visible tick tone, so all my visible subtools get exported, which is usually the eyes and the base for the head. Export it out as an FBX, then I take it into Maya, and here is a example render of what I usually get in Maya, but for purposes of this video I just keep the scene clean. So I already imported these heads and placed them around in the scene, so you can see they're here, and just turn on selection highlighting, there we go, so we can see what we select. Yeah, so this is basically a default Maya scene. As you can see, okay, I've set up a camera, but yeah, just to speed things up and organize my outliner a little bit. So I've hidden the lights for the moment, so basically what you're gonna get is, if you attempt to render this now, is just basically, there we go, nice black screen, but it's rendering from our camera view, and we can check that it is indeed doing the right thing, and the geometry is seen by the render engine by checking the alpha channel. So yeah, we can see that the big heads are there, so that's good. Now let's just go and set this up as if this was just a completely new scene. So let's bring up our render settings, let's go into presets, and we want to just reset everything to default render settings. So when you go into Maya, usually by default this will be on Arnold Renderer, and again, you can use Arnold Renderer or any other render engine, probably with very similar results. I personally use Redshift as that's something I use in my working pipeline, and I'm just used to using it, and I really like the speed of it. So this is what we get by default. Let's keep the values of 1960 by 540 for now, because all we need to do is just be able to see how our lighting affects the scene, and we don't want to put too much strain on our graphics cards, so, and we just want quick response time. So let's just keep this as is. I usually turn off enable default light, because with default light you're seeing this is how it will render. And actually I think I already have my material set up on this, so let's just reset it to our default Lambert shader. Yeah, there we go. So let's now assign the Lambert shader. So this is how your scene will look like by default when you import it into Maya. And the default light basically renders when you don't have any lights in your scene. It will render out something like this. So I like to turn it off just to, and let's restart our IPR render. There we go. So now everything is just dark, and I prefer working this way because as I add each light I can just see what it does. To be honest, even if you have an enabled default light on, the moment you put in a new light into the scene, you will already get the same result, but just for keeping things clean I prefer to turn that off. So first thing we want to do is add a little infinity cove into our scene, and to do that we just make a plane. Let's get rid of the subdivisions. Yep, there we go. Scale it up a bit. So this is similar to how you would do a real world photography. You are not in an empty space, you usually have some sort of infinity cove, something like that behind you. So let's go and edit mesh and bevel it, and let's reduce the curve a little bit, and let's add some segments. So yeah, so we just have a nice little curve. Make it a bit more curvy. There we go. Maybe 2.5. This is not really massively important. You just want to have a thing that like softly fades into the background and doesn't have harsh edges. Let's move it around a bit. So this is, as I said, very similar to how a photo shoot in a studio would be set up. Just gives you a bit of light bounce. Right. And now we want to try and get somewhere closer to this. So first things first, let's just try and render it. Let's just put in for now, a dome light, just to see like what's happening in our scene. And for this renders, I don't usually use dome lights. Dome lights are very powerful when you can just assign an HDRI to them, and it will give you a nice result right away. So for example, I can show you, have like I quite often use this HDRIs from SIBL website. They're quite nice, just good for testing purposes. So let's say the old industrial hall, and assign the environment, and you can see it just creates a nice soft lighting right away. You can just rotate it around, and yeah, you can already get some quite nice results just with this. And with playing with materials a bit, especially if you have something reflective, it would really bring things out for you. But for this type of studio render with just we want to get just a nice looking kind of sculptural look, so we don't particularly need this. I prefer to use just a more or less a 3-point light setup. So let's just start with chucking in a physical light, and in different render engines this will be called different things. I think in Lyra it was called rectangular light or something like that, but the idea is you basically have a light which projects from this whole square area, so similar to an area light in photography. Sorry if I'm confusing the terms, I'm not a photographer per se myself. And but it actually helps looking at how photography shots are set up and just exploring these ideas. So you kind of, let's just start with a simple 3-point light system. That's what I usually start with, and then I evolve it a bit more as and when needed. So there we go. That looks pretty terrible, and that's because all of our lights are really bright, so we need to reduce the exposure on all of them. So let's just do that. Let's just dial it down a lot. So there we go. That's starting to look a bit closer to where we want to go. But now we need to assign some materials. And here is our material editor, and at the moment everything in the scene just has the default lumber shader. So let's search for Redshift material and add the Redshift material to our background first. I mean, this doesn't have to be in that order, but let's just start with that. So name it, because good naming, always important, especially when you're working on a project with other people and you don't want them to hate you. So let's bring up our attribute editor. So this is the attribute editor for our material. We want to increase the roughness because you can see there is a very sharp reflection at the moment from this light over here that we can see reflecting in the background because of our new material. So we want to first of all maybe make the background darker because that's the look I usually go for, and let's bring the roughness up so that, yeah, maybe to 0.5. So you can see that just creates a nice little background there without the harsh reflections. And now let's create a new Redshift material and name it something like shader heads. And let's select all of our meshes. Delete all infinity curve, we're not using it. But yeah, that was just the hidden one from the scene before. We're not actually deleting our new infinity curve. So we do keep our infinity curve that we just created. This is just, I deleted something that was left over from before and hidden. Yeah, so let's go back to our shader for the pig heads, and we want to select all of our pig heads and we want to assign this shader to them. So you'll notice the pigs are now very shiny and reflective, which is again not something we want to be that reflective. We want some reflection on them, but we want quite a nice soft one. So generally I tend to go with like I don't know, between 0.4 and 0.6 for this specific renders. This a lot will depend on your material, what material you want it to be. Like if you want it to be shiny plastic, you want to have the roughness quite low down, and if you want it to be more diffuse, then you bring it up. As I said, I usually keep it to like 0.6 for these renders. And you can see it's already getting somewhere. I mean, it's not quite right yet, and I managed to key everything in the scene, so, and also crush the scene. So that's what happens when you press S, because in the scene, with whatever selected, it will just key all the channels. What I wanted to do is having the render window selected to press S to show our old snapshots, so just to compare. So yeah, you can see it's not quite there, but it's already getting somewhere. So let's just keep working on it. one thing that we want to do is actually turn on GI, so we have a little bit of light bounce, so we don't get this really dark areas. And partly it's also a stylistic choice, because I actually work very often for personal things without the GI bounce. I don't often necessarily like the GI look, but yeah, it's a stylistic choice. It's I think normally when you work in production you do use GI, so something to just keep in mind, that you know, as artists we can break the rules. We don't necessarily need things always like physically correct. So yeah, I think let's start moving the lights a little bit so that there is a bit more light on the snout. There we go. It's a bit nicer. Let's turn it around and take it a bit back. Maybe let's scale the light down. This is what I like about Redshift. You can just pretty much preview it real time. Like, well, specific, not really, I suppose, specific to Redshift, just GPU rendering in general. So crank up our light a little bit. There we go. And maybe the light overhead is a bit strong, so let's take it back and make it more into rim light. And you can see actually now the light is showing up, so what we want to do is make it invisible, so it still casts the light, but it's not really visible to the camera. Again, not something physically correct. In a photo studio you would see the lights, but again, photographers often Photoshop the lights out later, so who cares about physical correctness, right? Whatever looks good, looks good. Let's move this back. That will give us a bit of nice rim light on the pig's snout here on the side. So that's starting to look nicer. And why don't we just go crazy and break away from our 3-point light and make it into 4-point or 5-point or whatever. Like, this is the fun part. You just add lights and see what works nice. So as you've noticed, I'm quite a fan of this rim lighting. Makes things look nicer. Maybe let's move our code a bit down so it's not in the way, and bring it back a bit. And let's play with the material. So just bring out the background material attributes and let's make it darker so it's a bit goes more in the back, and maybe let's bring the roughness up a bit more. So okay, that doesn't seem to actually do very much, so we can leave it where it is, but maybe then just move this light forward so it's not as harsh and we don't just see this huge harsh line that we did on the background. But yeah, so you can see it's starting to go in the right direction. So maybe let's duplicate this light at the top, bring it forward a little bit so we get a little bit more exposure on the top of the pig's heads. And we can take this one and just bring it back so it's more of a rim lighting rather than overhead lighting. Maybe bring down the intensity a little bit, and yeah, with this one maybe let's make it thinner and bring the exposure up. Yeah, this is, at this point, this is just basically playing around and seeing what works and what look you like. Like, there is no right or wrong here. This is just something to experiment with and see what you think works for you. Yeah, I mean, something like this I'm quite happy with. I still don't like that the snout is very much in the dark there, so maybe I just make one tiny little light specifically to highlight our main pig's snout, but not affect much more. There we go, just to bring out a little bit of detail. Maybe copy the light again, duplicate it, put it on the other side, just to bring a bit of definition, maybe drop down the exposure. And again, this is something that will be quite bespoke for every model, and you might want to spend a bit of time tweaking this, but for the purposes of this video I'm not gonna go too far. I mean, this is already not miles away. You can see the lighting is a bit different, so in some ways it's actually maybe nicer now, but yeah, you can tweak it until you get exactly the same. I do actually have my old light set up here in the scene still, so we can see how my old lights were set up, but I'm gonna just probably keep these lights for these purposes, so I can just call it lights new, and I hide this group and I quickly unhide the old ones. So yeah, this was how my old lights were set up, so you can see it's a little bit different of a setup, but again, that was something that I liked at that time, and at this time let's just go with this because I think it doesn't look too bad. In fact, maybe in some ways it's a bit nicer, got a bit of a nicer rim lighting on the side pigs. But yeah, this is just something to play with. Well, another important thing, though, that I actually use very often when I'm lighting my Zbrush models and doing this renders, is something I do with the material for the actual model, and that would be to add a curvature node to bring out the, well, curves and caves in the model, and it's just, I show you what I usually do. So you have this Redshift curvature node, and again in our node you have AI curvature, which is the same, like it has this options for convex and concave, same as this one, convex and concave. So I'm pretty sure this is transferable between most render engines. I remember when I used V-Ray, that also had a curvature node. So this is something that should be transferable between different softwares and different render engines. And what we want to do is take this curvature node, we want to set it to be concave, because we want basically the bits that are concave on the model, we want them to be a bit darker, while the bits that are convex, we want them to be a bit lighter. So for that we have this VRAM, and we take the output of this curvature and plug it into the V coordinate, because this is a VRAM. So what you'll see happens now, if we put this into the diffuse color of our pig heads and set the render going again, you can see that actually it's doing the reverse of what we need to do. So the concave areas became lighter while the convex ones became darker. So all we need to do to fix that is just reverse our RAM, and we probably don't want it going all the way to just white, so let's just keep it kind of light gray, and yeah, just dark gray or just fully black. I mean, I think in 3D probably better to just never use fully, like, full values of colors. Always nice to have a little bit of slightly off black and off white. So you can see that brings up a bit more detail, and in case that's actually not very clear, let's just save this render and let's unplug it and see how, like, yeah, if we just put it to sort of gray. So this is how it looks without it, and this is how it looks with it. So you can see it just brings out a little bit of detail and a little bit of definition to our models, which is very nice for the models we spent ages sculpting in Zbrush, so we want to see the definition. So let me just put it back in. There we go. And we can play with the value here, which is the radius, and basically it's very much based on the size of your model and your scene. So I think for this I found this scale that I'm working in, found like the value of 0.3 works quite nice. So again, like you can just see that brings up a little bit more definition. And the other thing I like to do is to just add a little bit of subsurface scattering, and in Redshift you have a couple of ways of doing it. You have the proper multiple subsurface scattering, but you have this kind of single scattering, which is not sure of all the technicalities, but it's basically a bit of a quicker way of doing it, and it's probably a bit fake, but I find it works quite nicely. Again, it depends on the scale of your scene and everything, but I found the value of 15 works quite nice for me. So you can see that just softens the model a little bit and just gives it that nicer, like for the light to scatter, so you can just see a little bit more of it, and the whole thing just looks a bit softer. Again, you might want to play with this value. You can try and set like some color to it and just basically see what happens. I mean, I just prefer for this renders to just leave it on white, but you can experiment with these values and see what results they give you, and maybe discover something cool. But for my intents and purposes, I just leave it on white for this previews, and that's pretty much it. So maybe one more thing that you might want to do is go into the coating and add another specular layer on top of this, so that, yeah, you have your very diffuse sort of rough look for the base, and if you just want a little bit of more highlights and more interest in your model, just put that on, and yeah, you can see that adds like an extra layer of specularity to your model, which you might want to reduce the roughness to, I mean, increase the roughness rather than reduce, so it's less reflective, and then just, you know, play with the weight. You don't want to have a weight of 1 there, you just want a little bit of coating, just so it gives a bit more definition. Again, I actually don't do this very often for this type of renders, but in production I quite often like to add multiple layers of specularity to the models, as it just gives it a nicer look, I think. And that's that. So we have our render now, and one thing you might want to do is tweak the parameters for higher quality if you're rendering it to a higher resolution. So yeah, if I set this 1920 by 1080, I probably would increase the samples, just ramp them up a bit, and set the full render going, and there we go. You can see that's just rendering. And that pretty much concludes how I set up my materials and renders for this kind of little animal sculpts. Sometimes I also go into the exposure panel here and I play with values. If you switch it on, you can see that changes things, and this is very similar to any camera. So if you're into photography, you probably know all this ISOs and f-stops and whatnot. So yeah, you can just play with this and get the look you're after. So yeah, I like to maybe increase the f-stop a little bit so that the whole thing is a bit moodier and darker. You can play with vignetting, just add a little bit of a nice vignette on the side. You can, well, for this desaturation doesn't really do much since we don't really have any colors, so we can keep it off, and we can, yeah, we have allowed overexposure, which we can play with. So yeah, the highlights just get a bit more blown out or less blown out. We can have a little bit of black crush threshold, so we can just crush our shadows a little bit, and there you go. That's pretty much where the render is. I hope that was helpful, and hope you like this channel. Like, subscribe, press whatever bell button, and yeah, hope to see you soon. Cheers.